What's up, Minnesota sports fans? I'm Dusty O'Connell, and I am joined by Minnesota sports blogger extraordinaire Arif Hassan, and you are listening to Norse Code, the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. It is the beginning of the football season, finally. Season 7 for your favorite or possibly second or third favorite Minnesota Vikings podcast. And we're glad that you're here still hanging out with us. And if this is your first time joining us, then welcome. We look forward to an entire season of hijinks, drama, and I don't know, something other than eventual crushing disappointment. At least that's my goal.
Good luck with that, I guess.
Well, see, it's easier, and we can talk more about this later, but it's easier because I feel like expectations are somewhat lower this year than they've been in years past.
Yeah, it's true. Disappointment's all relative, which is going to be the theme of one of the mailbag questions we tackle later on.
It's all an expectations game. And this week, we've got, speaking of expectations, we've got an interview with an intrepid member of the SB Nation Falcoholics blog in honor of our upcoming football match against the Atlanta Falcons. But first, I just wanted to take a moment and direct everyone's attention to patreon.com/Norse Code, where you can become a sponsor of the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. We encourage you to donate at the $3.50 a month level. Only takes about $3.50 to keep the Loch Ness Monster away. But if you feel like giving us more money every month, we would certainly appreciate it. It helps keep the lights on here and helps keep the garlic on our mashed potatoes, so to speak. You can also make a one-time donation in any amount you desire at paypal.me/Norse Code, which someone has done. Thanks, Damien. The promo, seriously. Damian Barrett writes in, here's my annual $3.50 to keep the lights on, plus an additional $20 to slap Dusty. Regrettably, there will be no slapping. You can blame James for choosing not to join us in this episode.
He is still alive, by the way. That has not changed. He's alive.
I know what it sounds like. I know what it looks like. I know what y'all think. I see y'all on Twitter. I swear to God, he's not dead. Not even tied up in my basement. I don't even have a basement.
A likely story.
It's from my lips to God's ears. So thanks, Damien, for contributing to the show. Rumor has it that I'm supposed to join James at some sort of important social event later this year. And if I know him, he's already got a bag of slaps waiting for me. So your day will come. And with that, let us turn to the order of the day. Joining us this week, all the way from Daytona Beach, Florida, where currently there is no hurricane, as I understand it, is a writer for the Falcoholics, Evan Birchfield. Welcome to the show, Evan.
I appreciate you having me.
Yeah,
we are glad to snag you on such short notice. And I don't know. I was actually listening to the Falcoholics 53-man roster breakdown today by way of show preparation, and I was wondering. I was like, I wonder which of these voices is going to grace our fine show this week.
I'm glad you guys. Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, I'm glad you're having me on. I look forward to talking about this matchup.
Yeah, and we'll get to that matchup in a second. But one of the reasons that you said that you volunteered to be on our podcast is because you narrowly avoided the fate of being a Vikings fan, and instead fell out of the frying pan and into the fire, so to speak, and became an Atlanta Falcons fan. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I was born in Western North Carolina, and at the time, the Panthers weren't there. So the closest team in location was, going down to Atlanta, which was about 2.5, 3 hours away. My dad is a lifelong Minnesota Vikings fan, and he has been, throughout the years. And he took me when I was 6 years old to go watch the Vikings and Falcons play, my first NFL action in person. And, I was 6 years old, so like I didn't really care. It was more about the colors. And at the time, the Falcons had the, black helmets,
Yeah, the
black
All
jerseys.
Blacks.
And
Oh,
yeah, and it was
hard to
just
beat.
like, that's pretty much why I became a Falcons fan. But his goal was to turn me into a Vikings fan, so it's pretty funny to look back at. And then, I told you off air, when they don't play each other, I'll cheer for the Vikings, because I want his team to do well. But, I've come accustomed to understanding all the players over the years and stuff like that. So it's I was like, you know what, I'll definitely do the show because I think I know like a decent amount about the team and whatnot. So hopefully my services will be used, great here. So yeah.
I just find it incredible that you went from one perpetual disappointment franchise to another. It's beautiful in
Well,
its own
okay,
way.
so like, a couple years ago when the greatest thing ever happened was when you guys, obviously beat the Saints in the playoffs. That was a double whammy because I hate the Saints more than anything on earth. And also, I got to see my dad basically crying, of excitement and joy. So that was one of the greatest moments in my life.
I
for
learned
sure.
how to cross stitch just so I could make a giant cross stitch that says Diggs sideline touchdown and hang it on my computer.
That's awesome.
That's a lie. I don't know how to cross stitch. Arif was just sitting there in stunned silence.
Yeah. I can't believe you just go on the internet and lie like that. All right, well let's talk a little bit about the matchup. For our Vikings fans, they're probably sick to death of roster analysis, which we'll probably do anyway later in the show. But they don't probably know as much about the Falcons except that they drafted 2 offensive linemen in the first round that I personally, either of them, I would have loved to have on the Vikings. But we can talk about that in a second. I think the most interesting thing is the return of Dirk Ketter, the offensive coordinator that they had back in like 2012 before he became the head coach of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, called plays for them until last year when Todd Monken called plays pretty spectacularly, and then was let go. So how do Falcons fans feel about Dirk Ketter?
Well, I mean, over the years, Falcons fans, there was a time where we had Kyle Shanahan as our offensive coordinator, and that first year, we actually started off, I believe, 5-0, and then it kind of like the Falcons just kind of exploded, and everybody hated him. Yeah, we're used to it here. But everybody, the fan base exploded. They will love you when we're doing good, but the second we do bad, they're like eating you alive. So they hated Kyle Shanahan, and then we got, obviously the Super Bowl year, which we know how that went. And that, and then he left town, went to San Francisco. So we brought in Steve Sarkisian from Alabama, who has since returned to Alabama, I believe. But anyway, so the team hated him, the fans hated him.
The team probably hated him too.
Probably, definitely, yeah. And then, now Dirk Cutter's back, as you were mentioning, and it's really weird because like the fans aren't really talking about it. They will once the play calling, something bad happens, and it definitely will. As a Falcons fan, we're used to it. They'll jump back on that, like, please fire him bandwagon. And it gets kind of exhausting, to be honest, because as bad as Steve Sarkisian was in the first year, he definitely improved in the second year. And the same thing for Kyle Shanahan, where in the first season, everybody was bashing him. And then the second season, they were like ready to build him a statue up until that last half in the Super Bowl, obviously. So, you can't really put too much stock into what Falcons fans say when it comes to the offensive coordinator. But personally, I'm fine with it because he was in Atlanta before previously. So he's used to, Matt Ryan's comfortable with him and stuff like that. We have more issues along the offensive line, I think, than people care to admit. But yeah, we did address it in the draft, and the future should definitely be bright along the offensive line. But they're going to have a real test, obviously against the Vikings defensive line, who's, probably the most underrated in the league. No, I'm not just saying that because I'm on your show. Danielle Hunter is supremely underrated as a human being and as a football player, because that dude, like, he's what you would want to look like. Like he looks like a monster. And he's great on the football field. And it's going to be a definite test because right now we have one of the guys we drafted, McGarry. He actually had like
he has a
heart
heart condition or something, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and he had I mean, I'm not a doctor, so I don't know the specifics of it, but it was like a heart. I don't know, something was going on with his heart where he would get tired easy or something. Apparently, they knew about it before they drafted him.
Yeah, I think I heard that most of the teams were pretty aware of it, which is why I'm kind of surprised he went in the first round, because I saw him as a guy projected to go between rounds 2 and 4, depending on kind of how you felt about him. A lot of people thought that he could only be a guard, but he has tackle flexibility, and that hurts his potential draft stock. So with this heart, it's like a cardiac ablation or something like that, that required procedure. It's kind of surprising he went into the first round. Do you think that so nobody on this show is a doctor, so feel free to make stuff up. And only 1% maybe of our listeners are doctors, so you're probably in the clear. But from what you've heard about like the reporting about it, do you expect him to be able to even play this year? And also, second question, do you think, given that pick makes sense for the Falcons in the first round?
I was definitely shocked at the pick. I also agree with you that I thought he was more of a second to third round guy. I mean, the Falcons had to jump back in to grab him because earlier they took Chris Lindstrom. I think it was like the 14th pick. I can't remember, but it was earlier in the draft. And that was honestly a shocking, thing. But Matt Ryan was sacked, I think, 42 times last year. And he takes way too many hits. And the way this Falcons offense works is if Matt Ryan's getting hit every play, we have to protect him, because if not, it doesn't matter if you have Julio Jones or Calvin Ridley, because he's going to be on his back. The Falcons' run game struggled mightily last year. So that's kind of why they went more in that offensive direction, I believe, earlier in the draft. And, we didn't have a ton of holes, so we were kind of blessed with that luxury of doing that. And McGarry has actually, he has looked pretty good in practice. Throughout preseason, we had 5 games, but he was only able to play in the final one against Jacksonville last week, and he looked incredible. So it shows promise, but I don't think he's going to be ready to answer your question. He's not going to miss a season, but I think they won't actually start him until maybe like week 4 or 5. They're going to ease him in. We have Ty Sambrailo, who I definitely do not want them to start. But there's a newer guy. He's I believe he's in his second or third year, Matt Gono. He's pretty good. He's very serviceable. But McGarry's definitely the future, but he's not going to be ready for the Minnesota game. It would be like a complete shock if they started him. But yeah.
All right. Well, when it comes to kind of the offensive design, do you expect it to look a lot like the 2012 Falcons? Do you expect it to look maybe a little bit like the more recent Bucks? Because Ketter's probably also evolved as a play caller between 2012 and now.
Yeah, that's what's interesting is, I mean, I really have no idea what to expect, because we have all these offensive weapons like through the air, but also Devontae Freeman's healthy. If the Falcons have one thing, it's depth at running back. Brian Hill has looked incredible during the preseason. Ito Smith looked great last year. And we just signed a fullback, Keith Smith, who was, more well-known for blocking for Zeke for many years before going to Oakland.
There's 6 running backs on the roster then, including the fullback, right?
Yeah. Well, Kenyon Barner is technically a running back,
okay,
but he had like one carry in the preseason. They're not going to. But even Quadri Allison, who we drafted out of Pittsburgh, looked really well during the preseason. So yeah, we've got a ton of running backs on the roster. So you got to think they're going to run the ball a lot. But it's kind of hard to ignore the passing weapons Matt Ryan has. So. It's going to be very interesting. I don't think it'll be quite like what we experienced in 2016 with the Falcons having to put up like 40 points or more in a game to win. Our defense is looking a lot better than it has in, I can't even remember, at least over a decade. So I think it's going to be a more balanced team overall. But Yeah, I mean, the key is honestly just keeping Matt Ryan upright, and they're going to have a true test week 1, so we'll know by, Monday what's going on.
That's fair enough. I think that's true for both teams. I think there's a lot more questions to be resolved for both teams heading into week 1 than for a lot of teams across the NFL, and I think we'll probably answer a good chunk of them. One question I think probably will never be resolved is how good is Matt Ryan? Because I think there's a lot of variance along the spectrum of where people kind of place him, but it's not also also I don't think fair to call him a polarizing quarterback because people don't get angry about where you rank Matt Ryan. Maybe because he's like personally just a very boring person, but like people will debate online forever about like where would you rank Cam Newton, who also has like a wide variance. But Matt Ryan, I've seen him as the 4th best quarterback. I've seen him as the 10th best quarterback. What's your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, if you took Matt Ryan, I mean, I'm obviously biased because,
Right.
I'm a Falcons fan. But if you took Matt Ryan's stats and threw Brady or Rodgers' name on it, you would be like pretty much, giving him the MVP every season. Like last year, he actually
incredible year
he
last
won
year.
In 2016.
Right.
Yeah, he won the MVP in 2016. But last year, his stats were actually almost better in certain areas. And he definitely didn't get the respect because, I mean, I don't know if you saw the NFL Network's yearly players thing or whatever. I think he came in like, in the 60s or something. So he's definitely not getting the respect he deserves. And he's not very vocal. You're not going to see him making headlines for something he said or, he's pretty like what you want as a franchise quarterback. He's silent, but he's a great leader. But in terms of ranking him, especially right now, I mean, it's tough because you don't know, like, Aaron Rodgers, how he's going to do, like, for this upcoming season anyways, because he's got a new coach who actually was the quarterback coach for the Falcons in 2016, so that's kind of funny. And then you look at, I mean, Brady, Brady's always Brady, and he gets more because of the name, but it's not like he's putting up crazy stats either. I would say he's a top 6. I'd probably put him at 6 or 5.
Okay.
But obviously, I'm biased towards it.
All right, so we'll have to adjust based off of your Falcons bias, and then I guess we kind of before we move on to the defense. I have a couple of questions about receiver. So obviously you've got Julio, who's one of the best receivers in the game. Falcons fans tell me he's the best, and there's a pretty good argument for it, actually. And then you've got Mohamed Sanu, who I think has been a consistently underrated second receiver / quarterback. And first round pick Calvin Ridley, who didn't get a ton of yards last year, but got like a good chunk of touchdowns. And I just kind of want to know where you feel about kind of all these guys, especially Julio, who doesn't actually score that many touchdowns relative to his yardage totals.
Yeah, Julio's biggest thing is he gets you downfield, but then what the Falcons have struggled, that was Steve Sarkisian's biggest thing, is they get in the red zone, and it's like they just didn't remember they had Julio Jones. They would do something random. They'd run, a bunch of plays that just didn't work. And they would even run the same exact plays, and it just fans would be like, "What are you even doing?" But yeah, having Calvin Ridley definitely helps. I'm expecting him to have a big year this season, just because when you have Julio Jones and Mohamed Sanu out there, and you put Ridley in the slot, on top of that, we have Austin Hooper, who's really taken leaps as a tight end. You're going to have to guard somebody. One of the bigger names I think that's going to be big this season is Russell Gage. He was more of a special teams player at LSU. He has in the preseason, he flashed a lot, and he's going to be used. He pretty much secured the 4th wide receiver spot away from Justin Hardy, who's been on the roster for a couple seasons. But Russell Gage is definitely a name to watch. It's just, that's why it ties back to what this offense is going to do. It's really a fun offense. It's just, I don't envy having to decide like where you're going to put the ball, because there's a lot of options there. But you obviously have Julio Jones. You want to feed your, number 1 receiver. But Ridley has flashed in the limited action he's had this preseason, and everybody knows what he did last year. He had like a really solid rookie campaign. So, I mean, it's going to be fun. It's very exciting. Yeah, that's all I got.
That's fair. I mean, there's only so many things you can say about kind of how good that receiver core is. One of the things that seems to come up when we talk about receiver cores is, who has the best trio, who has the best duo, right? And so,
Hmm.
you've got, DeAndre Hopkins with, I don't know, Will Fuller, or you've got, Julio
Right.
with Mohamed Sanu or Calvin Ridley as part of the duo. But, a lot of people will say, well, the reason you rank that duo so high is because individually these top receivers are fantastic, right? And we don't really know
Hmm.
that the second character in that duo is really pulling their weight. So when you compare, the Vikings are often said to have the best receiver duo in the NFL, and part of that is because
Definitely.
though neither Adam Thielen or Stephon Diggs are as talented as Hopkins or Jones or Antonio Brown, which I'm sure some people listening to the podcast will be kind of annoyed, but I think that's fair. Neither of them are as talented as that. They're also the second, whoever is second among those two is much more talented than the second in that pair, whether that's Calvin Ridley or Will Fuller or
Hmm.
whoever. So when it comes to that discussion, which admittedly is a very arbitrary discussion, what are your thoughts on, say, figuring out who the duo is, because if it's a trio, the Vikings lose; they don't have a wide receiver 3. But if it's a duo, who the second character in that play is, but B, how you would rank them against the Vikings duo.
I mean, that's tough because obviously I have the biasness. I look at Julio, if you were to assign them letter grades, I think Thielen and Diggs are a solid A- B plus thing, where Julio's like an A plus. I don't think they're as a lot of people overlook them. I think they're solid. Like every game I've seen them in, Thielen just exploded out of nowhere. And I love his background that he grew up a Vikings fan and stuff like that. I feel like that just goes completely under the radar all the time. Diggs, I love. I just think his athleticism is like remarkable. If I was to compare them, though, it's kind of tough because Julio's he's just a freak. Where you could pretty much have me and Julio out there, and we'd still like do well. Where Diggs and Thielen, I think they benefit off each other. But if I was to say like who I'd want, I'm obviously biased, so I'd have to take the Falcons, but I'd say the Vikings were, if the Falcons are 1A, Vikings are definitely 1B because I don't think they take a backseat to anybody in the league. When you look at the Steelers had Brown and Juju
Right.
Smith-Schuster, but now they don't, obviously. Off the top of my head, I don't know who else you would want in terms of a duo over them. Because Ridley, okay, Sanu isn't at that level. He's definitely a worse receiver than Thielen and Diggs, and it's not even close. And Ridley, he should get there, and I hope he does. But balanced wise, the Vikings have a better wide receiver core, at least the starters, I believe. Where Julio and Ridley, Julio's only getting older, Ridley's young, but he's still got some more steps to take.
Right. He hasn't demonstrated that at the moment.
Definitely.
Okay, that's fair. Nice diplomatic answer. I think that gets nobody mad.
Yeah. No, but I have the utmost respect for Thielen and Diggs. I think they're wonderful receivers.
No, it's fair. I mean, so do Vikings fans, right?
Yeah.
It's a lot of fun, I think, to have those two on a team, especially because their friendship is kind of legendary. It's like a JD Turk situation. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the defense. Last year, defense didn't perform very well at all. I think it's one of the reasons you mentioned that Matt Ryan's pretty tremendous statistical year kind of went under the radars because the defense didn't really put them in positions to win. A lot of injuries. So Deion Jones out for the year, Ricardo Allen out for the year, Keanu Neal out for the year. Now those players are healthy. Unfortunately, I think one person that was signed, Michael Bennett, was signed, right, and he's probably out for the year.
Yeah, he had a hand injury
right.
or something.
But still, it seems like now with the defense healthy, right? Presumably, who knows what will happen over the course of the season. They're in a much, much better spot. You mentioned already that the defense is looking better. There's a second round pick from last year, Isaiah Oliver, who's going to be a cornerback that's replacing Robert Alford, who I feel like has always been kind of underrated. He's been kind of like a Trey Wayne speed guy. What are your feelings on the defense? Why do you think it's taken a step forward? Is it just from what you've seen? Is it because they're healthy? What's going on?
Yeah, our defensive line, unlike Minnesota, has been our Achilles heel. Basically, they just been rough forever. But they recently got Tack McKinley in the draft. Grady Jarrett has kind of taken that next step and got paid this offseason. Alan Bailey, he's going to be one of the defensive starters along the line. He was, pretty good with the Kansas City Chiefs. We brought him in this offseason. Tyler Davison, he's a defensive tackle that was brought in from the Saints, and he's more of a run stuffer, nose tackle type, but he's really good. Adrian Claiborne, who was more popular for having, I believe it was like 5 or 6 sacks against the Dallas Cowboys. Yeah. And that's just the defensive line. And then you look at the linebackers, Deion Jones. We've had Devontae Campbell. He if there's Minnesota fans like the college or University of Minnesota, he's been solid for us for a couple seasons. Jermaine Grace has stepped up this preseason. He was a practice squad guy from the University of Miami. And then you look at our secondary, as you mentioned, Robert Alford is no longer with us. He's that one that had that interception in the Super Bowl and returned it for during the first half. He is gone. He went to Arizona, and I believe he went on IR recently, so that sucks for him. But the Falcons moved on to Isaiah Oliver, who he's shown a lot, but he hasn't been talked about a lot this offseason because it's going to be, when you look at the defense with everybody healthy and ready to go, that's kind of the big question mark is Desmond Trufant. We all know what he kind of is. He's not like elite corner, but he's definitely like towards the top. Oliver's going to have a big role to fill, and then you look at who his first competition is. I'm not sure which one he'll match up against, but it's not like with normal teams like we were talking about where you'd have DeAndre Hopkins and Will Fuller. So you'd have like supreme talent and okay talent. You have great talent. So he's going to be going up against a true test, regardless of which receiver he's covering. We also have DeMonte Casey, who's more of he came as a safety out of college, but he's more of like an X factor. They're going to play him at nickel probably. He actually led the league in interceptions randomly last year because he had to step up for Ricardo Allen, Keanu Neal going down. But the defense has been very solid. It's just, it's going to be interesting seeing it put all together with all the healthy pieces because during preseason, you would see a lot of these individuals flash, but it wasn't as if the whole team was out there. So when you get them all out on the field, that's really where you're going to know, okay, this is where they are. Maybe they're better than what we think, or maybe they're even worse what we think, and they're more of like a on paper sort of thing. But I think what's great for the team is they're not going against a cupcake in week one. They're actually going to have to step up and play a, supremely underrated offense, as I was saying earlier. It's a good test for this team on both sides of the ball, really.
All right. Well, how do you think, based off of what you know now, where the defense is going to basically end up? Do you see them as being, a top half defense, top 16, top 15? Do you see them as potentially even kind of a top 10 defense? Because when you take a look at sort of the peaks, right? Like you take a look at like Deion Jones and Keanu Neal and, and I think Desmond Trufant's had some really great years too. When you take a look at the peaks, you can kind of see where you'd get a high level defense from. But at the other end of the spectrum, Alan Bailey's starting and, he's not a premier defensive end. They've struggled to get production out of Vic Beasley. And as much as I, love the Adrian Claiborne game, there's questions about his like game to game consistency because he had 8 sacks that year and like 6 of them were in the one game.
Yeah. Exactly.
Where do you feel kind of, it seems to be a secondary driven team, which is kind of how the modern NFL seems to want to go, which is a good thing. But at the same time, there's just a couple of questions here and there along that defense.
Yeah. I think as a Falcons fan, we're kind of used to having a garbage defense. So if this defense finishes in the top 15, that would be the greatest thing ever for us. I'm definitely not saying they should be top 8 or anything like that, but I think the sweet spot would be from top 20 to top 15, somewhere in that area. And I think that would just be enough to propel this team, assuming the offense doesn't completely melt down or do something fluky. And then obviously you have to account for injuries. They do happen. Hopefully nothing important to one of our big stars like it did last year. Last year was more of a worst case scenario where the defense looked abysmal because we literally had our best people out for multiple games and some out for the whole season. But yeah, I mean, one of the biggest question marks that Falcons fans have been arguing about is Vic Beasley, obviously, because he led the league in sacks one year and then just kind of fell off a map the rest of it. But Dan Quinn made it a thing to focus on him and improving him over the offseason. And also, Dan Quinn is also taking back he's our defensive coordinator, basically, which he did in 2016 when we went to the Super Bowl. So there's a lot more like optimism we're looking for than actual like factual. Okay, this defense is going to be great. Right now, I would say they're more towards the top than they are towards the bottom, but there's really nothing to show for it just because there really hasn't been any way to prove it. But I mean, if they come out, even if they lose against Minnesota, if they come out and keep the game relatively low in terms of scoring, I think that pretty much shows what we can look forward to because, being in a division where you play the Saints twice a year, and even Tampa, we, for some reason, always have putting up points on us. It's going to be tough, and the defense has to be good. And as you said, it's a passing league. So, that's why Isaiah Oliver is really going to have to step up to the plate when he's starting this year. But I'd definitely say top half, I'd probably go 14 right now. That seems like a nice number, but
sure. Okay. I'll ask you about kind of how you feel about the game in a second, but there's just like random players all over the roster that have caught my eye for whatever reason or the other. So I'm just going to ask you really quick questions about those players to satisfy my personal curiosity. First, John Kaminsky. I loved him coming out of the draft. He had kind of a whatever Senior Bowl because it looked like he was trying to figure out what he needed to do. Small school guy, incredible combine. What is your take on kind of how he's performed in training camp in the preseason?
Yeah, he's definitely a Dan Quinn guy. He's got a high motor, doesn't give up on plays, which is like what you want exactly on the defensive line. His preseason action, he's looked really solid. He's definitely not going to start right away, but he's one of those players that could force his way into it because they just want to keep him on the field. There was talks of him potentially even getting some defensive tackle play. I'm not sure how that's going to go because our defensive tackles are pretty good this year. But he probably won't be on the field a whole lot. Definitely not in the Minnesota game, unless it's like to come in for an injury or something. Mm-hmm. But he's definitely a fun project that could lead to being an eventual starter. I like him though.
Cool. One of Josh Norris's favorite players, if you ever pay attention to Roto World, one of the guys that I liked coming out in 2018 just because of his again, incredible pro day out of Yale, Foyesade Oluokun. I think I pronounced that close to okay. He's listed here as a backup, but in quote-unquote base personnel, he's out in the field. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. He's really stepped up and forced Duke Riley pretty much backwards because Duke Riley was our starter alongside Deion Jones because they both went to LSU and stuff. Mm-hmm. But Oluokun, I think, was a safety coming out of Yale, and they switched him to linebacker. And he's looked very solid. I mean, they wanted to keep him on the field, so they kept him as a starter. But yeah, he's going to be fun too. We have a pretty good linebacker core, which we haven't had in many years either.
And then Bleedy Ray Wilson's kind of bounced around the league for a while. He was kind of fun. I think he went to UConn. He seems like is he the primary backup at cornerback, or am I missing that?
He comes in on nickel, but yeah, I would say he's more the primary. I mean, DeMonte Casey's going to be on the field a lot more, I believe, but it pretty much determines what packages they have out there.
And then here it lists Danny Etling as both, I think, former LSU quarterback, as both a wide receiver and a quarterback. I don't have a ton of opinions on him, but that designation interests me. What's going on?
Yeah, so Danny Etling, as you mentioned, he was with the Patriots, and he was a quarterback for the Patriots, but they switched him to receiver, and then like a day later, they're like, okay, see ya, and they just booted him out of town. The Falcons are like, hey, we could use you. So they brought him in. I was at the Jacksonville game, which, was last week, and they let him play the entire game. And he is very athletic. And I can see why they had him at receiver. And recently, they had to release him, and then he's now on the Falcons practice squad. But he's very talented, athletic-wise. He's definitely got to work on, the whole throwing thing. But good pocket of presence and stuff like that. But yeah, he's not going to be coming for Matt Ryan's job anytime soon.
Just very because I didn't watch him in college, so I was like, he didn't look like the kind of guy that would transition to another position. Maybe because he looked kind of like Matchsticks to me, and maybe I'm just remembering the wrong guy. But that's just endlessly amusing. And then last guy I'm going to talk about, another practice squad guy, Justin Zimmer out of Ferris State. He had some crazy numbers coming out of college, like 22 sacks over his career, something like that. Same school as I think PJ Hall, who was a first-round pick for the Raiders a year later. I want to say it's the same school. And also, like PJ Hall, destroyed the combine, or I guess his pro day, rather. Is he kind of interesting? Was he with the Falcons on the 90-man, or did they assign him from some other practice squad, or what's going on?
Yeah, so last year he actually started on the roster. Wait, what? But I think that, but that was in 2018. He was, he's serviceable basically, but it just speaks of how much better our defensive line group got this year to where they couldn't keep him on the roster. But I like him. He's definitely, a Dan Quinn guy, the high motor, and gives all he can on the field. But he's not on our roster to start this season anyways.
Right. All right. Well, thanks so much. Before you go, Vikings favored by 4 points. Who are you taking and why?
Ooh. It's in Minnesota. So, the one thing I love that I'm jealous of, with Atlanta is the Vikings fans. I love the Vikings skull chant, and the whole atmosphere is loud. And you can tell it just by watching it on TV. So I can't even imagine it in person. Good. This is tough. For some reason, I didn't even think of this. Like, I'll probably have to pick a winner. I'll go. Shoot. I'll go Vikings, but I'm going to say it quietly so nobody hears it.
Yeah,
but I think it's going to be a pretty close game. Maybe a touchdown. That's pretty much. I think the Vikings win by a touchdown, but I think the crowd is just going to play a big part in it.
Yeah, that's fair. You should try and make your way up. Like the skull chant it provides an incredible sense of presence in the stadium. It really is something else.
And then one of my favorite moments is that I think it was when you guys were playing at the University of Minnesota stadium while you were waiting, and wasn't it like Bud Grant came out in like a polo shirt or whatever, and it was like freezing?
Yeah, that was the Seattle playoff game. We don't talk about that.
Yeah. Well, just the beginning of the game.
No, that's true. It's incredible. He comes out in a t-shirt and polo. It's like, it's so cold out that they're recommending that people bring chunks of styrofoam to sit on so that the metal bleachers don't give their butts frostbite. It was one of the coldest games I've ever been to, which, I think that makes it memorable and really cool, but also, Blair Walsh misses from like 27 yards. So.
Oh, gosh. Yeah, don't even ask me about that. We just had him on our roster.
He's already gone,
2 weeks
right?
ago. Yeah, well, we brought Matt Bryant back, so that's why they got rid of him. But, if Matt Bryant didn't come back, Blair Walsh would have been our kicker week 1 because the Tavecchio, I don't know what happened. He went for 5 for 5 in relief of Matt Bryant last year, and then just blew up during this preseason. That's why they let go of Matt Bryant originally, and they brought Blair Walsh in, who, in actual games was okay, but he only played like 1, so.
All right. We would have asked a lot more questions about Blair Walsh if he had still been on the roster. Yeah, cool. If you've got anything to plug or any final thoughts, go ahead.
No, I'm just excited to have football back. If you want to read any of my Falcons stuff, I do a lot of fantasy football too. But you can find me on the Falcoholic.com or on Twitter at Evan Birchfield, and I'm happy to talk Falcons, Vikings, NFL, fantasy, whatever.
Cool.
And I appreciate you guys having me.
Yeah, man. Have a good one.
Yeah, Evan Birchfield from the Falcoholic SB Nation blog. Thanks for being on the show. Now we can turn our attention to the scintillating roster moves made by the Minnesota Vikings. As you can tell, I'm very enthusiastic. Well, so the hashtag Free Sloter movement was really gaining steam, and then I think someone in the front office took it the wrong way, and then Sloter did what many Minnesotans do once they're finally free of their Minnesotan responsibilities and flew straight to Arizona.
A bit early for a retirement, but still a pretty incredible move for him. I'm not going to rehash sort of every argument that people have been having about Kyle Sloter. The long and the short of it is, and Mike Zimmer spells it out once again in the presser immediately after the 53 was announced. You need your backup quarterback to be good on the whiteboard because they have so many responsibilities inside the quarterback room, on the sidelines, etc. If the Vikings are only rolling with two, then it cannot be Kyle Sloter. He can only kind of exist on your roster as a third quarterback, and the Vikings, for whatever reason, didn't feel like that was important. I go into it a little bit at The Athletic when I talk about kind of being able to make checks and do the right things on the field. I will say, kind of in addition to all of the stuff that's been said publicly, I've also kind of learned that in the preseason, he had a lot of problems getting the right play called, much less, adjusting the plays and stuff like that. So there's kind of a lot there, above the neck, I guess is what you'd say, that kind of limited his ability to contribute on a roster or project well going forward. And the final thing I guess I'll say about this is that we have to remember that teams will scout their own players much like they scout college players, where they don't look for the most productive college players. They look for the players whose traits translate best to becoming a starter in the NFL. And while production probably tracks more closely from the NFL to the NFL, it's the traits that teams think will kind of project going forward. And from a traits-based scouting perspective, Sloter was not kind of the player that would be able to help them kind of immediately. Hopefully, Sloter kind of proves them wrong and the Vikings regret their decision. I think that would be kind of a good thing, just because it'd be really cool to see someone with Kyle Sloter's story succeeding in the NFL. But I think the decision makes a lot of sense. And what's really interesting is that there's just not very many people in the beat community, as it were. So a lot of people know that Matthew Collar was pretty vocal about Sloter not making the team. Courtney Cronin was also pretty vocal about, Sloter, kind of struggling, between the ears. But, the beat community in general, they all kind of were trying to explain the Sloter decision. And there was a divide between them and the fans, who obviously they got to see him play in the preseason. And it created this weird resentment between the two. And when the Vikings cut Sloter, it was less about the beat community was proven correct about their Sloter takes and that they weren't just hot taking it, and more about the Vikings just making a critical mistake that the writers who have contact with the Vikings foreshadowed. It's just, I think it's just a very odd scenario where fans disagree with both the people covering the team and the team itself. I think that's kind of confusing.
A decision that met with less confusion was the release of Laquan Treadwell.
Yeah, a lot of people projected this kind of coming off the 53. And the thing is, I was definitely wrong about this early in the offseason, just because I was like, hey, they're not going to cut him because they're going to be subject to his cap hit either way. And so you have to ask, is the guy that you're bringing on going to be worth $500,000 or $1 million additional dollars over, the dead cap hit in an area where the Vikings have kind of a limited flexibility. They don't have a ton of cap. But, as time wore on, it was just very easy for me to say, well, that cap, it's going to happen either way. Just get rid of him. And the Vikings showed very little faith in his ability to kind of move above by continuing to demote him down the depth chart. He himself didn't demonstrate a ton in training camp, obviously in the preseason, in the fourth quarter of the third preseason game and a little bit in the fourth preseason game, he was showcased a little bit and he performed pretty well, at least statistically. But when you learn that they were forcing passes to him in order to do that, that's, maybe a little bit less interesting. But yeah, there's still some people that, believe the Vikings never gave him a chance and that he still has a lot of talent left to be unlocked. That frustrates me as somebody who, not only watches him in practice, but makes it, his job to figure out kind of these questions. And I want to say like these final things. I don't wish him poorly, but I want to say these final things. The Vikings gave him a ton of chances. He received more snaps than any other receiver on the roster for the past 2 years, besides obviously Diggs and Thielen. And the Vikings were in 11 personnel a lot. So he actually did see a lot of snaps. So it wasn't that the coaches weren't putting him out on the field, especially because he's been through a couple of offensive coordinators that have agreed on a lot of things. They agree that, Stephon Diggs, Adam Thielen are very good, right? They agree that, tight end Kyle Rudolph is worth some targets. He's had between 800 and 500 receiving yards over the past couple of years every season. And they all agreed that Laquan Treadwell was not very good, and they all gave him chances. And so they put him out on the field, and then quarterbacks, 4 different quarterbacks, decided he wasn't worth that many targets. He received fewer targets per snap than every other receiver on the Vikings roster, period, over 2018 and in 2017. And he received fewer targets per route running snap than every tight end on the roster in 2018 and every tight end on the roster but one in 2017, and that's Blake Bell, who was a quarterback in college. And also, he received fewer targets per route running snap than every running back on the roster last year and the year before. That includes C.J. Ham. So those guys on the field were more likely to earn a target from Kirk Cousins, from Sam Bradford, from Sean Hill, from Case Keenum. It didn't matter who the quarterback was. They were not likely to target him when he was on the field. And as a result, he earned fewer yards per route running snap than 5 different receivers, 4 or 5 different tight ends, and 4 running backs. He got every chance in the world and he didn't produce. And he also dropped the ball a lot physically dropped the ball a lot when he did get those chances. So a bunch of quarterbacks didn't think he got open, and when he got open, he dropped the ball. A bunch of coordinators gave him a bunch of chances, but then decided that Jarius Wright needed more snaps, or over the second half of the season, Aldrick Robinson eventually outsnapped Laquan Treadwell, although the first half, Treadwell massively outsnapped him, so he has more snaps over the course of the season. He had a ton of chances. So I'll say this. So that's one sort of take I want to get away from. The second thing is a lot of people have called him lazy, and that is definitely not true. He's one of the hardest, or he was one of the hardest working players on the roster, and he genuinely worked as hard as he could. He was even criticized by Mike Zimmer for working hard instead of working smart. And I think that people who criticize his work ethic, I think this is kind of just one of the things that is why I always have a lot of difficulty critiquing players for body language, for being lazy, for, intangible mental qualities that are very, very difficult to evaluate. Even praising players for those intangible mental qualities, I've always been a little bit uncomfortable because you can't really verify that kind of stuff, even when we know it to be the case. So, for example, Case Keenum, incredible locker room leader. I don't talk about that much because I haven't had kind of a lot of verification of that. And so I kind of go with what I have the ability to, have confidence saying. But I will say I have a lot of confidence in saying that Laquan Treadwell worked very hard. And the fact that he didn't produce on the field and the fact that he ultimately just wasn't a very talented receiver doesn't mean that he was lazy. And I think that bothers me more than people saying, he didn't get a chance, whatever, because at least they're being charitable, right? But the people who are calling him lazy just really tick me off because they've got no idea how hardworking or lazy he is. And even if they were right, they would have had no reason to know that they were right. And it just so happens here that not only are they wrong, they're incredibly wrong. He's an incredibly hard worker. I would venture to say he works harder than both Thielen and Diggs. Like, he's a very hard worker. He just isn't very talented, which is very unfortunate. So those are the things I want to say about Treadwell. But that does kind of allow us to segue into the additions the Vikings made, unless we want to talk about the most recent cut that the Vikings made as well.
Yeah, sure. We can throw that out there. I mean, it's a blip. I mean, at the end of the day, I think just anybody accusing somebody who is starting on any NFL team of being lazy is kind of making a mindless argument that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Like, just the amount of effort and skill it takes to make it onto the squad, like to make the final 53 for however long, represents an enormous amount of hard work and talent and desire. And I think it's easy to get lost in just how talented and hardworking these guys are compared to the thousands upon thousands of football players, both current and former, that are not playing in the NFL.
Yeah, absolutely. It's bizarre to me.
Oh, go ahead. Brett Jones, we hardly knew ye. News that broke just as we were about to start recording. The Vikings cut him as well.
Yeah, well, I'll say this. I disagree with the move. Jones, I think, is a starting quality offensive lineman, the only one they have as a backup. And there was a reasonable argument. I know the Vikings saw him as kind of a center-only player, but there was a reasonable argument that he should be starting at guard above Pat Elflein. And so he performed really well in the preseason. I think he might have had the highest PFF grade of any of the backups on the offense for the Vikings. But regardless, according to my eyes, not just PFF, I thought he played pretty tremendously. I thought in camp he played really, really well. In my 53-man roundup I wrote on The Athletic after the 53-man was initialized, I should say, not finalized, I praised him a lot, and I demonstrated, I've got a bunch of one-on-one charting that I've done, and I've demonstrated that for a center, he actually did really, really well in offensive line, defensive line, and one-on-one. So I think that this is a kind of a bizarre, baffling move. I know that the Vikings have 10 offensive linemen, and teams typically only have 5 or 9, and they only had 4 wide receivers, and teams typically have at least 5. So I get that that's kind of where you'd want to make that move. But if I'm cutting offensive linemen, I'm probably getting rid of Oli Udoh first, because I think I can put him on the practice squad. And if not, I might consider getting rid of Dakota Dozier, despite kind of his flexibility, because now the Vikings don't have a backup center except for Pat Elflein, which is not enviable, I think. So
how that goes.
Yeah, I don't love the move. I think it's a poor move. Hopefully, it doesn't matter. But because in theory, all 5 are going to be healthy all year. That'd be great. But I think that they got rid of their best backup.
And that's you'd think history would be a teacher in a situation like this. The struggle that it seems like we talk about. I mean, I took a whole year off, and here we are again. Like, oh no, if the offensive line that is more or less held together by toothpicks and chewing gum even starts to crack, then there's no depth. There's nowhere down to reach that could potentially bring up somebody of any kind of comparable quality.
Yeah. Oh, well. I mean, they should have learned their lessons. They haven't. It's who they are.
Struggle is.
Yeah. I mean, I'll say that, at least I think Rashad Hill is an underrated backup at tackles. They still have that guy for now, until they cut him for, I don't know, Corey Coleman. But
positional flexibility.
Right. So yeah, I'm a little baffled by the move. If they see him as a center-only player, far be it from me to say that they're wrong about that. I think that that's probably an area where I've got kind of the least amount of expertise in, and kind of determining when you switch players from position to position, whether or not a center can be a guard or whatever. And that would make him kind of, I wouldn't say a luxury as a backup, but it would make him a little bit more difficult to keep as a backup. So maybe that's it. But I still think that Brett Jones kind of playing out of position at guard is probably a little bit better than Pat Elflein kind of actually playing out of position at guard, honestly. Like, I know he played guard at Ohio State, but kind of weird. So I don't want to dwell too much on it, because I don't want to harangue a team too much for letting go of backups, but I think that this is a situation where you got rid of somebody who could legitimately compete for a starting position and was their best backup. So it bothers me, but we can talk about who they put on the roster instead of Brett Jones.
Yeah, I mean, this is just a great setup for the "I told you so" that we can bust out in week 12 or whatever. But I mean,
we're always laying the foundation here for a good "I told you so" at Norse Code.
Got to play the long game. The Vikings front office has, in an effort apparently to prove that time is in fact a flat circle, signed another 500-yard receiver after releasing one in Josh Doctson. Which, whatever you think of Josh Doctson as a player, I do not relish the thought of having to pronounce his name week in, week out. Like, do you pronounce the T? Is it Josh Doctson? Or is it?
I think you ignore the T, and then everyone just kind of gives you the benefit of the doubt.
So it's really more like Josh Doctson, like the wiener dog.
Yeah, well, without the because there's a slight hue in Dachshund, right?
Is there really?
I mean, a lot of people will do it.
Dachshund?
Well, I said slight. You just kind of it's an in-between vowel sound. We can talk about linguistics later.
At any rate, Josh Dachshund, for better or worse, is a Viking now. Kirk Cousins is theoretically happy about that. There are rumors that he was lobbying hard to summon the services of the oft-injured and, according to the Redskins, surly and uncooperative receiver. But it's the Redskins. Your mileage may vary. If you're a Redskins systems man, then Lord help you.
Right? Yeah, he's an interesting case. So the Vikings spent more time with Dachshund and Treadwell over the course of the run-up to the 2016 draft than they did with Michael Thomas or Will Fuller or Corey Coleman or whoever. They spent a lot of time on those two, and it was obvious. They thought that Teddy Bridgewater needed a receiver who's going to win contested catches. And remember, the context at the time is that you had Cordero Patterson and Charles Johnson at receiver, who were probably two of the worst contested catch receivers I've ever seen. Charles Johnson on contested catches was brutal, and I wish him the best. I think that because he got signed out of the AAF, I think he just got cut, but he's a great guy. But I mean, he's just awful at contested catches.
He's not a big fella that can jump. It's just there's not much other to say than that.
Right. I mean, he just got out-physicaled at the catch point all the time. But, it's kind of funny because at the time the Vikings did have two of the best contested catch receivers in the league on the roster in Adam Thielen and Stephon Diggs. So, really weird situation. Anyway, they thought they needed a big-bodied guy to win jump balls. And Teddy Bridgewater's history at Louisville, plus, we even saw him do it in the Pro Bowl, in the Pro Bowl that he was at. He's willing to give receivers chances if they're jump ball guys. And so, we saw that with Devontae Parker. We saw that with any number of the guys that he threw to in the Pro Bowl, and he puts them in situations where they can win if they're the kind of receiver that can win. So that's what we saw. We thought that that would be great for him, and at the time, Washington, we didn't identify a receiver as a huge need for them. So them picking Dachshund right before the Vikings picked, I mean, that was just bizarre. So the Vikings had to go with Treadwell, but he was probably their second receiver on the board because of how much time they spent with the two of them. And I guess the rest is history. But yeah, neither of them, it turns out, panned out too much. Josh Doctson was injured his first year. I think it was an ankle or Achilles thing that kept him out his rookie year, especially the second half of his rookie year, because I think he played the first couple of games. And then after that, never really flourished. He ended up getting 6 touchdowns in 2017 with Kirk Cousins throwing him the ball. So I think that's going to be part of it, that familiarity he has with Cousins. But, he never got over 550 yards. He beat 500 yards in the last 2 years, which I guess is a good milestone, but just barely both times. So that's kind of part of it. He's still a big-bodied contested catch kind of guy. He's above 6'2". He weighs just a little bit over 200 pounds, or he did at the combine. You kind of want your contested catch guys to be like 220 or something like that, like Alshon Jeffrey or something. But that's he's been good at that in college. He mossed Minnesota when he was playing for TCU for a good chunk. I think it was 2 touchdowns and 80 yards or something like that. He's the weaknesses on his scouting report have basically borne out because he was great at contested catches against, and I think it's really funny. I wrote in my scouting report on him back in 2016 that he's going up against receivers that all weigh less than 180 pounds. And I listed them. I said, you've got Holton Hill and Duke Thomas, which they both played for the Vikings this year. And then you've got, Duke Shelley and Darrell Patterson. Duke Shelley also ended up making it into the NFL. And they're 160 pounds. And I listed one more guy. He ended up making it to the NFL. So I thought it was kind of funny. But at the time, they were basically freshmen. And they were all very light. And so it was very easy for him to out physical them. And then when he went up against the more physical corners at West Virginia and Minnesota, obviously he did well in Minnesota, but he didn't do well against press. He didn't do as well when cornerbacks went up to contest the ball with him. So it was kind of interesting. I said that might be a limitation. He's got great intuition, but not great route running. He's got a good sense for when the ball is in the air, but he doesn't have a great sense for how to kind of deceive defensive backs or how to kind of adjust his route to the coverage that he sees. And that's all been true heading into Washington. He's not been as physical. He's a very poor yards after the catch guy. He has to win deep downfield in contested catch situations. He ran a 4.50 at the combine. He doesn't seem to be that fast. Certainly he's faster than the Treadwell, who ran a 4.71 and seems to be even slower than that. But that's kind of a concern. But he ran a 6.843 cone. He had a 41-inch broad jump or vertical jump. He had a really great combine, all things told, a 1.56 10-second split, which I think is really good. But he hasn't shown up as a very athletic or very physical receiver when you put the pads on. So there's some concerns there. He produced about 500 yards a year, like I said, and he was, I think, the top receiving yardage option in 2017 and the second receiving option to Ryan Grant in 2018. The receivers just haven't produced very much in the last 2 years. Obviously, when Pierre Garçon and Jamison Crowder and they were all there, they ended up having pretty good years. But for the most part, they haven't produced over 600 yards with their receivers over the past 2 years. So him having 500 yards, maybe that's not as big a deal. But I do think it's a concern, even because when he was with Cousins, he was a starting receiver that only got 500 yards, which is very Charles Johnson-ish. And so can he be a third receiver? Because if he puts up 500 yards as a third receiver, that's an unqualified success. I think that's great, especially for the contract the Vikings likely got him at, which is probably around the vet minimum. So that's great. And I think he's better than Chad Beebe, which means I think this is a good move. Certainly he's better than Laquan Treadwell. So it's a good move, but I don't think there's a lot there to be excited about as a wide receiver 3. Like, I'd be more excited, and I know wide receiver 3 is not a position that draws a ton of excitement, but I'd be more excited if they somehow got Jarius Wright back or if they signed Aldrick Robinson. They're just more exciting players that I think have more upside to work with Kirk Cousins and could develop into more reliable options, because Doxson, I think, is a bit of a dart throw.
And additionally, I had, I heard the news that Britton Colquitt was being released, and I thought to myself, boy, he'd be a good fit for the Vikings. But I didn't think he would ever, I didn't think the team would ever pull the trigger on him. And I was wrong. I wish I had launched that hot take into the Twitterverse when I had.
Yeah, it would have been great.
Because I could have actually been right about a silly roster move for once in my silly life. But here we are with what appears to be the end of the I guess the punter drama in.
You'd think. We'll see.
Sure, we haven't won yet. I should probably hold my tongue for a moment.
Right. What's really funny is that he punted for. That's a weird phrase, he punted for. But no, he punted for Mike Prefer in Denver back in 2010. and had an opportunity to come to Minnesota when Minnesota was looking for a punter in free agency. I think right after they got rid of Jeff Locke, I want to say, and Mike Prefer was a big reason why, and he was like this close to signing with Minnesota. He ends up signing with the Browns, and I think he was with the Browns up until obviously he was just released by them, and then of course he ends up with Mike Prefer in the final year of in the final offseason with the Browns, and they let go of him for some guy named the Scottish Hammer, which is a pretty good superhero name, I think. But yeah, he's a member of punting royalty. His dad was a very good punter in the NFL. His brother, Dustin Colquitt, is a Pro Bowl punter. He's really good. His nephew was in the NFL for a bit as a punter. It's a weird family tradition, but it is one, and he's a part of it. So that's kind of cool. He has got a lot more personality than I expected. He was kind of fun to talk to the other day when the Vikings made him available to the media. He's a little bit cocky. They asked, "Hey, do you think you're a better holder than Chad Beebe?" And he said, I hope so. I'm confident I'm a better holder than him." And then, later in practice, he apologizes to Chad Beebe, who wasn't even aware that he made these comments. So great.
No, and I forget the actual quote. I'm kind of paraphrasing, but I think another one of the things that kind of endeared me to him in kind of like a pat on the head sort of way during that media scrum was when he was like, "Sure, I think we should just excel at all levels of the game. Like, why can't we have elite special teams and elite offense and defense? Why don't we just be the best at everything?" And I'm like, well, that sounds great.
Yeah, he's like the protagonist in an anime. It's great. It's because he was asked, like, is there a special teams course in Minnesota? He's like, no, there's no specials. I don't believe in that, except Tampa Bay when it comes to drafting kickers. They should probably stop doing that. Which that shot through me. That was great. But he doesn't believe in a special teams curse, which it sounds like tempting fate, but fine, whatever.
Obviously, for the Vikings.
Right, yeah. He can't. He's like, therefore he signs with the Vikings. But what I find interesting is that I think he finished that sentence you were talking about with, "This city deserves a good punter," which is just an incredible sentence.
Oh, it's a good thing he's here to save us from mediocrity.
Yeah, well, I mean, he's confident. What's interesting is last year he had a very low net yardage rating, or net yardage in punts. It was like 38.4, low net yardage. And I was like, well, that's weird. He's been considered a very good punter. Why is that? And is this low net yardage a problem? Because if you take a look at, the punting stats that matter, Chris Kluwe is very vocal on Twitter about a lot of things. And one of the things he's been vocal about in the past is which statistics we use to evaluate punters. And he's written a couple of articles about this too. And one of the statistics he'd prefer we use over gross punting is which is also a fun phrase. Gross punting yardage is net yardage, because your hang time is going to determine how well your coverage can prevent that punter or that punt returner from creating additional yards. And so if you've got low hang time, you might have great gross punting yardage, but you'll have poor net punting yardage, which is one of the reasons that Kari Vedvik was let go, because his hang time was low, and as a result, his net punting yardage was pretty poor, even though his gross punting yardage was fine. And his was poor. So I was like kind of looking into this, and he has had a remarkable number of punts inside the 20, a ton of punts downed, fair caught, or kicked out of bounds. And he's got a pretty high PFF grade, and they care a lot about these kind of statistics. I mean, you talk to Gordon McGinnis, their special teams guy over at PFF, and they've done a ton of work into making sure that their special teams grades are really on point. They've talked to a ton of special teams coaches about how to grade special teams units. They've consulted with a couple of punters, including Chris Kluwe, about kind of how to grade those punters and punts. And he ended up with like the 10th grade or something like that. I think one of the reasons that we think he is good, though, I think is because of Dustin Colquitt, who is just an incredible punter for Kansas City. But still, I mean, he's been pretty good. He's relatively accurate. Obviously, his hang time is pretty good. I think his average hang time, 4.34 seconds, is about kind of average across the league, which is, I think, a good upgrade over Matt Weil and Kari Vedvik. And unlike Ryan Quigley, who got a lot of punts inside the 20 and had a poor net average, he still has the capability to boom it when he needs to, which was not something that Quigley could do. So that's all the punting upside, I guess. And he's fun to talk to. So there's all that.
All right. Well, we got about 15, 16 minutes left. It should be just enough time to tackle these like 3 or 4 mailbag questions. Let's have a look inside the old bag ski. Christian writes in and sent us a question on Twitter at Norse Code DN. You can we always put out a little bat signal every week for a call for questions, usually a few hours before we record. But you can send us questions anytime, and as long as they're of reasonably high quality, we'll be sure to get to them at some point on the show.
I'll warn you that Dusty has a higher bar for quality when it comes to mailbag questions than the not departed James.
Yeah, James is most certainly not dead, and yeah, well, we can address that later because Christian has a burning question. He writes, I feel like the range of outcomes for this team is a little more high variance than in the past few years. I could see this team going 6-10 or 12-4, and I think maybe the worst outcome is more likely. So you've seen this movie before. Am I being too pessimistic, or are we perhaps reaching the end of an era? What era? Question.
So I'll say that it is very difficult to be too pessimistic about the Vikings. I think it's very unlikely if you're like checking your own prediction, you're like, am I being too pessimistic about the Vikings? Probably stow that thought. It's very unlikely that you are. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, to me, I feel like it feels that way to me too, that there's a wide range of outcomes that I could see and not be surprised by. But if I look at the team on paper, it's very difficult for me to justify it. I think on paper, there's kind of a very narrow, potentially positive range of outcomes. And I think they're a playoff team, right? I think they're a 10-win team this year, and I could see 12 for sure. But it's very, very easy for me to see an 8-win team. Obviously, that's basically what happened last year. And it's easy for me to see kind of a 6-win team. I think that it is difficult for the Vikings to be 4-12 or 6-10. I don't think those are as likely as the 12-4. So maybe I'm kind of on the optimistic side on this distribution curve. But yeah, I mean, I totally get it. It just feels like everything's up in the air. Certainly, I think that any team that finishes, 7-9-1 or 8-8 or whatever, it's always going to feel like there's going to be a wide range of outcomes for that team. Just because you see all the improvements, and then you also see kind of what it looks like when things go wrong. So I'll say that I probably see a narrower band than you do, but I understand why it feels like it's a kind of a high variance team. I'll say that I thought the 2015 team had a wider variance than this team does, because we were just coming off of a season where Teddy took over for Matt Castle as a quarterback. We didn't know how much he was going to grow. The defense hadn't really established itself as a top tier defense yet. It was a significant improvement over the 31st overall defense, I want to say, in 2013. But it was still not a top half defense, and so we didn't know where that defense was going to go. You had a second year quarterback that, though he won Pepsi Rookie of the Year, which I understand why people didn't think that was a very appropriate award for him. There's just such a broad range of outcomes for him that you could have seen anything. So I'll say that was probably a higher variance year. I think entering 2016, before Teddy's injury, it would have been probably kind of easy to say that this was a high variance year, and then obviously it did end up being a high variance year. And then 2017, mean, obviously that was going to be a high variance year after we learned that Bradford was going down in week 2. I want to say week 1 must have been week 1 because week 2 was Tampa, and or maybe I'm getting the schedule all wrong. But yeah, just a very odd set of outcomes for the Vikings. So it depends on when you're asking if this feels like a high variance team. If we're asking at this point in the season, Teddy had just gotten hurt. And so that was a high variance year. 2015 was a high variance year. I would say that this year doesn't really compare to the uncertainty of those 2 years.
Well, and you think about the talent on the team and how good a team would look if it fired consistently on all cylinders. I mean, not to turn this into a baseball show, but for example, the Colorado Rockies this year had a team that looked like they were pretty stacked with talent. Gold Glove infielders, one of the best third basemen ever to play the game. And what seemed like would be a more consistent pitching staff than the year before. Before the season started, all the discussion was, well, are we just going to get a wild card ticket to the playoffs, or do we have a chance at unseating the world-beating Dodgers? Well, long story short, the Dodgers beat the entire world, and the Rockies went on to have a miserable season where they put up a franchise worst July and then followed it with a franchise worst August. And not necessarily, I mean, there was some injury issues that came into play, which I think is going to be the biggest determinant of Vikings success. But, all the places where everybody thought the team would be great, we just stunk. The pitching was wildly inconsistent. The fielding was inconsistent. Despite playing at the most hitter-friendly ballpark in the league, we couldn't hit for crap. We had a better record on the road than we did at home. And it was just, the wheels just completely fell off. And by basically after the 4th of July weekend, everybody in the media and on the team were just kind of looking at each other like, where did we go wrong? How did this happen? And I think that the Vikings are similarly talented. I think if they were to fire on all cylinders for an entire year, which never happens in football, I get that, they would have a path to 12-4, fairly easily. We have a stellar defense, and we've got a lot of bright shining stars on offense too. But just like we were talking about at the top of the show, just like every single year, it's all going to turn on the relative health of the offensive line. We're just a couple injuries away, a couple of, really brutal mismatches away from, giving up 2 or 3 wins here and there. And I would like to believe that the base level of talent on the Vikings is high enough to prevent, a 5-11 season. But I'll be really surprised if we can find a way to 12 wins.
Yeah, yep. I think that's fair, especially because the nature of a 16-game season in a violent sport is that inconsistency is more likely than consistency.
Kyle writes in on Twitter, which was weirder, us carrying only 4 wide receivers on the roster, or that one time we carried 7 for several weeks?
Well, they resolved the 4, so I guess that's been fixed. But it did take a while.
A few days ago, and Kyle even admits it. But I guess so. Assuming it was still 4, which would be weirder.
I think the 7. I know it's a passing league, and it makes sense to have more receivers or whatever. But the 7, it was just who are these guys? I don't care about these guys, except for I think Adam Thielen was one of them, and I was an advocate of keeping that guy. But Rodney Smith, I think, was another one, and who cares? So that was very odd because you weren't holding on to a ton of talent. Whereas with 4, it was just well, yeah, they all suck. That's why you cut them. So, it made sense. Plus, football is composed of so many moving parts that if you have 4 instead of 6, right, then you've added two pieces somewhere else. Maybe here it seems like they did it at running back and a little bit at tight end or whatever. So okay, fine, that's what you did. And you can use those players, right? You're going to put, a couple of tight ends out on the field. You've got a stable of running backs that you can rely on. One of them is a kick returner, so that's fine. With 7, you're taking spots away. I think at this point they took spots away from tight end and offensive line. And again, I'm remembering off the top of my head, but that sounds about right. And it was just like, this is an incredibly thin tight end core. And we talk about this every year because that's like one of the low key consistent talks from year to year is 2 tight end sets. We've been talking about that since Musgrave. But we've talked about 2 tight end sets, and there's like 3 tight ends on the roster, and one of them is like somebody that's a developmental guy. So you're not going to see him. So that was just like very weird that you ended up putting 7 at a position where you didn't love your depth anyway. And then you took away from a position where you wanted to have more of those kinds of players on the field. So that was, I think, more bizarre to me.
Well, so when you think about how kind of wide receiver has become I gotta think about how I know what question I want to ask, but it's tricky to put into words. So I apologize if this takes like 2 minutes. But when you think about the kind of trend in officiating in the NFL over the last couple of years, that seems to have made wide receiver theoretically a less physically dangerous position to play, like with the rules and the tackle rules and all that. Do you think that puts some downward pressure on the number of wide receivers that's worthwhile to carry?
A little bit, actually. That's a good way to put it. I think it might, but at the same time, it's created kind of a knock-on effect, a strategic effect, where you prioritize passing even more. So now the wide receivers are in positions where they're going to be hurt more often, even though each individual interaction is less likely to result in injury. So because it's a league where they've incentivized passing, they've created more situations where we've seen 3 wide receivers on the field instead of 2. That's gone up dramatically over the past couple of years. So in another sense, it actually, because of those rules, has encouraged us to put wide receiver in harm's way more often, kind of like a moral hazard, like insurance, encourages people to flood insurance encourages people to put homes on like, mudslide risk areas. Kind of the same way, they're less likely to be hurt from play to play. Let's put them in that position more often. So you see receivers doing that more. And then, you've got, like last year, the Vikings had like 650 dropbacks, right? Instead of like 400, which was standard around 2000. So I think that's an interesting point, but I think it's countermanded. No, that's a counterweighted. There we go. There was no commanding officer. It was counterweighted by the strategic implications of that kind of change.
Well, and so maybe that raises the base value of a guy like Josh Doctson.
Right. Yeah, no, I think so. And I think that's, I think so it was more bizarre to have 7, but I think it's still bizarre to only have 4. It was just so weird when 7 happened that took the cake. But it's so weird to have 4 that they did need to end up resolving it before the season started. And it was kind of funny because we asked this in the post 53-man announcement presser. Hey, is this weird? Are you concerned? And of course, Zimmer was like, why would I be concerned? Yeah, right, yeah. Who cares? Okay. Thanks for giving us that insight.
Next question. From whatever. Raul writes in via email, and you too can submit questions to the Norse Code email inbox. norsecodepodcast at gmail.com is where that goes. Raul writes in, hey guys, on the topic of first round disappointments, so everyone, should a player's current value be influenced by what round he was drafted in?
It depends on how long ago he was drafted. So I think that like priors matter. Like I think that if you know a player is a first round pick, that gives you a lot of information about how much talent he has, right? It doesn't give you complete information because there's first round busts. But if a first round rookie as a receiver has 300 receiving yards and a 7th round rookie as a receiver has 300 receiving yards, there's a really good chance, and this is statistically true, that the first round rookie is gonna explode in his second year more than the seventh round rookie is. So like Tajay Sharp, who's in the fifth round, is a really good example of this. He didn't end up turning into anything. And you'd think it might even be the other way around, right? You'd think it'd be because coaches give the first rounder more chances, that the seventh rounder had to overcome so much in order to get those 300 receiving yards that he's the more talented one. But that's not the case. It turns out that historically, players who put together 400, 500, 600 yards, what round they are, is a good predictor of whether or not they're more likely to break out. And so, you can take a look. I think I also did this for first round guys that in their third year even. So it's not even just the first year, because, we were asking the question a couple of years ago, is Laquan Treadwell about to break out, right? Which classic question. And he had just finished his second year where he'd gotten a catch, 2 catches. I don't remember, not many. And I looked at the history of players drafted between, I want to say 20 and 50. And so you're looking at late first round all the way to like the middle of the second round. You're looking at those players, and then I compared that group to third and fourth rounders and fifth and sixth rounders, and the first rounders, even after their second year, were much more likely to break out than your third and fourth rounders. Even though a lot of those third and fourth rounders got the same number of snaps and opportunities. If you're a third rounder, you either basically break out right away, or you kind of just don't break out at all. So that's like your Mike Wallace's and stuff. So yeah, what round a player's drafted in actually does tell us, even after they've had 2 seasons in the NFL, kind of what we should expect from them going forward, because very, smart people, and I've been critical of NFL draft front offices a lot, but very smart people have watched a ton of this player and have done a ton of evaluation on this player and determined that he was 9 times more valuable than this other player who's drafted a couple rounds later, right? And so there's a lot of history that kind of informs the decision-making process. So our prior should include that, right? Now, whether or not it makes sense to like keep a player, like that's like a contract question that has nothing to do, I think, with their or not, I shouldn't say nothing, but it doesn't have as much to do with kind of their potential for breakout, because you're basically asking that question at the end of 4 years. And at the end of 4 years, which I think this was the end of his third year, but at the end of 4 years, that advantage essentially evaporates. And, a guy who's produced 300 yards a year for 4 years, it doesn't matter if they're a first round pick or a fourth round pick. They've got basically the same prospects by the time you get to that point. So yeah, I think it does change their value. I think a lot of people say, first round picks, they just get extra unfair chances, but it's not unfair. They did a ton in college to prove that they were worth a first round pick. Usually, like, sometimes it's like Justin Hunter. He just blew up the combine and he wasn't very good in college, but whatever. But yeah, that does give us information.
Yeah, and I think too, it's easy. There's so much noise involved that it's hard to separate what's meaningful from what's not in any given draft year. But I think it's important to look at which year a person at a given position was a first round pick, because certain position groups will be flush in a given draft year and create a lot of competition, and certain ones will not. And then every now and then you get 1998, where the first round brings you both Peyton Manning and Ryan Leaf.
Right. Yeah.
So as with all things, your mileage may vary, but no, I think that's I think you make an interesting point about the value of trusting the professionals.
I don't like saying that usually.
That's why I said it for you.
Yeah, thank you.
Blame it on me. So I think that's going to do it for episode 284. Wow, that's a lot of episodes. Episode 284.
Holy
Norse
crap.
Code. Oh, God. It's like when somebody asks you how old you are and you tell them and you're like, lived this long? How embarrassing.
I forgot my ID a couple weeks ago and I was at a bar and I was like, I'll have a beer, and they're like, we need your ID, and I was like, that's ridiculous. No one ever cards me. But then also I was like, oh yeah, I guess I forgot it. Never mind. I guess I'll have a Coke or whatever. And they're like, well, how old are you? I was like, oh shit. Let me think about this. You couldn't just ask my date of birth.
Right, so 1988 was when? Who was president then?
Yeah. Despite my suspicious hesitation, I still ended up getting the beer. I won't name the establishment because I guess they violated the law.
Low key, my I run into that. So Colorado has very onerous identification laws. The official statute is that if somebody appears to be under the age of 50, you have to ask them for their ID, and if they don't have it, then you can't serve them. Which leads to lots of interactions that are not at all awkward with people who are obviously older than me at bars or restaurants where I'm trying to serve them. And in the unlikely event I come across somebody who is presenting something like it looks like them, but I still have a couple of questions. I'll ask them what their sign is, because nobody knows the whole zodiac, but everybody knows their own sign.
That's really smart.
And if somebody like hesitates, and if they're like looking on their phone, I'm like, yeah, you're fine. You can have a club soda. I think.
Well, so I would probably hesitate a little bit just because it's an unusual question, but I imagine that looks a lot different than hesitating because it's like, shit, when does Scorpio start?
Well, and you get it right. Like, you'd never be like Capricorn, which is
right. Yeah, exactly. I'd be like, what the? I'm a Libra. We're not dating now, are we?
I know. I end up on a lot of accidental first dates that way, but occupational hazard. Thank you to Evan Birchfield. You can find his writing at the Falcoholic blog. Make sure you throw out a nice skull for him and his father, regardless of their poor choice in football, the team enthusiasm.
Rooting interest.
Yeah, exactly. Rooting interest. That's a better way to put it. Thanks to you, of course, Arif. James will probably be here for the recap episode. That'll depend on how good he is at unlocking.
Being alive.
I mean, what? We'll have to cut that out too. But yeah, on behalf of all of us here at Norse Code, I'm Dusty O'Connell. Thank you so much for listening, and you will hear from us next week.
Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's Vikings blog at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif Hassan, and he can be found on Twitter at Arif Hassan NFL. I am your producer and co-host, and my name is James Pagashnik. You can find me at the show's official Twitter feed at NorseCodeDN. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, you can make your one-time donation at paypal.me/NorseCode, or a recurring monthly contribution can be made by visiting patreon.com/NorseCode. Any questions or comments that won't fit in a tweet can also be sent to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. On behalf of the Norse Code staff, we thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this. We go out, we hit people in the mouth.